The given RC passage is a first-person narrative by the writer of the book, The Man Who Had All the Luck. The author says that although his book did not adhere to the absolutely definite rules of playwriting, non-observance of which would bring about failure to the author of any play, but his book, despite being manifestly non-objective in this sense, was, although called unnatural, was a success. He further says that moreover neither I nor its director, a dear fellow named Joe Fields, really understood its anti-realistic thrust. Then he discusses that a few critics explain their uneasiness about certain sequences in the play, but however he mentions an event very explicitly, that is a boost that he gets from John Anderson. He's a big shot. The critic for the Journal American. This fellow is all praise for the author. He says that, but I sense some strange shadow world behind the character, a fascinating gathering of darkness that made me wonder if you've thought of writing tragedy. A doom hangs over this place, something that promises tragedy. Right. Furthermore, Anderson says that you've written a tragedy, you know, but in a folk comedy style. You ought to try and understand what you've done. So Anderson's advice to the author is that he should try and understand what he is writing, although instinctively he's done a great job, but he doesn't know what he is really doing. Right. So he says, then further on, the author is unable to stave off a question from his mind that Anderson once then asked him, "Are you religious?" He has asked, blind not only to myself but to what my work was trying to tell me. I thought the surprising question absurd. If anything, The Man Who Had All the Luck seemed an anti-religious play. So the author thought that his play was more of an anti-religious play about a young man who had renounced his own power to the heavens and could only be saved by recognizing himself in his work. So he goes about saying that the action of the drama sometimes betrays the author's intent, the author's prejudices. So despite the fact that David's tragic death was not demanded by the play's action, the play, he says, embodied a desperate quest on David's part for an authentication of his identity, a longing for a break in the cosmic science that alone would bestow a faith in life itself. To put it another way, David has succeeded in piling up treasures that rust, from which his spirit has already fled. That means David, all his life, he was piling up treasures that rust because his spirit has already fled. That means David died a tragic death despite the fact that he kept piling up materialistic treasures. So this was the paradox that would weave through every play that followed. Now let's look at the questions that follow. Which of the following statements is correct with reference to The Man Who Had All the Luck and the Broadway scene at the time of its production? Now option A and B, they talk on similar lines. A says the play had just caught the trend at Broadway at the time it was produced, thereby making the play an obvious success. This is incorrect. As per the first paragraph, the play was impersonal, as was the trend at Broadway, making the play an obvious success. This is also incorrect, because the last line of the first paragraph states here that the man who had all the luck was manifestly non-objective in this sense and therefore unnatural. So it cannot be impersonal. It was rather non-objective. So therefore A and B can be eliminated. C says although Broadway regarded non-objectivity as appreciable, the play was objective. So Broadway did not regard non-objectivity as appreciable. According to Broadway, impersonal plays were appreciable. So this is also factually incorrect. D says although Broadway regarded objectivity as appreciable, that is, impersonal plays were appreciated, the play was non-objective. Clearly the man who had all the luck was non-objective is given in the passage. So therefore the answer to this question is option D. The next question says, what did Mr. Anderson mean by saying you ought to try and understand what you've done? Let's look at this line here. Anderson says that you've written a tragedy, you know, but in a folk comedy style, you ought to try and understand what you've done. So clearly Andersen means that the author himself doesn't realize what he is writing. He's written a tragedy, but in a folk comedy style, right? So this is what the author does not realize, and this is therefore the answer to this question is option A. Mr. Andersen was making a point about how the author had written a tragedy in a folk comedy style. B says Mr. Andersen was making a point regarding the lack of clarity in the play which he thought the author could address in his next work. Andersen makes no reference to clarity, the need for clarity or lack of clarity in the play. Therefore, option B can be eliminated. Mr. Andersen wanted the author to elevate the religious theme mentioned in the play to a higher level in this next work. Mr. Andersen does not want the author to practice any, wanted the author to, Mr. Andersen did not want the author to adhere to any particular style or any theme. Therefore, option C is also incorrect. Option D says Mr. Andersen was interested in making the author aware of his amazing talent. We do not know this. We do not know if Mr. Andersen was interested, thinks that the author's talent is amazing. This is very opinionated, not given in the passage. Therefore, option D is incorrect. So, therefore, the answer to this question is option A. What is the context that would weave through every play that followed? Last line of the passage says that David has a, the last line of the passage says that that David died a tragic death, and all his life he kept piling up treasures that rust. So clearly David was all his life trying to find an authentication of his identity, but as and that uh, authentication, that finding of the identity would bestow a faith in life itself, but unfortunately David died a tragic death, and therefore uh, even Andersen says that it is more like a tragedy. And this paradox of David piling up treasures all his life to only die a tragic death is the paradox that the author weaves through every play that follows this play, right? So the answer to this question is therefore option B, which says the fact that the main character sought authentication of his identity but ended up losing it in materialistic pursuits. Option A says the fact that the main character piled up treasures from rust and then committed suicide. The author nowhere states that David committed suicide, therefore option A is factually incorrect. C says the religious fact that while the character could only be saved by his work, yet his tragic death and the renunciation of his identity beckoned inexorably. This is not being referred to in the last line. D says the paradox of life, well lived and undeservedly tragic death. We do not know if hoarding of material wealth is a life well lived. So this is very subjective, and therefore and whether David did not deserve did deserve the tragic death, uh, or whether David deserved or not the tragic death he died. So therefore option D can also be eliminated. Hence the answer to this question is option B.